If you're planning a PC build right now, something probably feels off. GPUs aren't getting cheaper the way they're supposed to. Even when launches happen, even when supply improves, prices stay stubbornly high. Most people blame scalpers, crypto, or temporary shortages, but that explanation doesn't hold up anymore. The real reason GPUs are getting more expensive has nothing to do with gamers. You were told US export bans cut China off from Nvidia's most powerful chips. That sounds like it should free up supply for everyone else. But the opposite happened. Instead of shipping GPUs to China, those same chips are being locked into massive overseas cloud data centers, reserved for Chinese tech companies training AI models around the clock. Those GPUs never reach retail, and when tens of thousands of high-end GPUs disappear into long-term contracts like that, the result is simple: less supply for PC builders and higher prices for everyone else. Once you see how this loophole works and why it accelerates into 2026, you'll understand why waiting for prices to normalize might be a losing strategy. The revelation. Nobody was supposed to notice. This story didn't break with a press conference or a dramatic announcement. There was no warning, no official statement, no moment where anyone said, "Pay attention to this." It surfaced quietly through investigative reporting, the kind most people scroll past without realizing what they're looking at. Near Osaka, Japan, there's an unremarkable data center operated by a local company. From the outside, it looks like hundreds of others scattered across Asia. Steel walls, industrial cooling systems, and rows of anonymous servers humming around the clock. But inside that facility sits something the US government explicitly said China would not have access to: Nvidia's Blackwell GPUs, the B200s, the most powerful AI training chips Nvidia has ever built, and the very chips Washington placed under strict export controls to slow China's AI ambitions. And this isn't a small deployment or a technical pilot. The data center houses roughly 15,000 Blackwell GPUs, operating at full scale. What makes this revelation explosive is who those chips are really for. That Osaka facility is effectively dedicated to Tencent, one of China's largest and most influential tech companies. Through a 3-year agreement worth about $1.2 billion, Tencent secured access to this computing power using a third-party structure that keeps everything technically legal. No GPUs were shipped to China. No crates crossed borders. No export licenses were violated. The chips stay in Japan. The servers stay in Japan. The laws stay intact. But the AI models trained on those machines belong to Tencent. The intelligence, the data, the capability, all of it flows back to China through the cloud. From a legal standpoint, this checks every box. From a geopolitical standpoint, it undermines the entire point of the export ban, because the most advanced AI chips in the world aren't just near China, they're already working for it. And once you understand that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If this is happening in Japan, how many other places is it happening to? What the export ban really says, and what it doesn't. When the US announced export controls on advanced AI chips, the message felt simple and decisive. China was being cut off from the most powerful semiconductors in the world, and with them, from the future of large-scale artificial intelligence. That narrative spread quickly. Headlines echoed it. Officials repeated it, and the public largely accepted that the problem had been contained. But export bans don't work the way most people assume they do. They don't ban intelligence or capability. They regulate movement. Specifically, the US restricts the physical export of its most advanced GPUs to Chinese entities. Chips like Nvidia's Blackwell series cannot be shipped, sold, or directly transferred into China, and those rules are enforced with real penalties. What the restrictions do not clearly regulate is what happens after those chips are legally installed somewhere else. If a Blackwell GPU is sold to a Japanese company, installed inside a Japanese data center, and never crosses into China, the transaction remains compliant. If a Chinese firm accesses that computing power remotely through cloud infrastructure, the law does not explicitly prohibit it. This is the critical distinction most people miss. The ban is geographic, not functional. The chip itself can't enter China, but the work performed on it can still serve Chinese companies, Chinese models, and Chinese data. That's how US officials can truthfully claim the export ban is holding firm, while Chinese tech giants continue training advanced AI systems on hardware they were supposedly denied. And it's why this loophole wasn't created by accident. It exists because regulating physical exports is straightforward, while regulating cloud-based compute spread across borders, data centers, and intermediaries is vastly more complex. Once you see this gap in the rules, the real question isn't whether it will be used. The question is how aggressively it already has been. And that brings us to the cloud workaround, the cloud compute workaround. Once you understand the gap in the export rules, the workaround almost explains itself. If advanced GPUs can't be shipped into China, then the solution isn't to fight the ban head-on. The solution is to move the work somewhere the ban doesn't reach. That's exactly what Chinese tech companies began doing. Instead of importing hardware, they began exporting workloads. The chips stay overseas. The data centers stay overseas. The legal ownership stays clean. What crosses borders is compute access. Tencent's arrangement in Japan shows how this works at industrial scale. Through a carefully structured third-party agreement, Tencent signed a 3-year contract worth roughly $1.2 billion to secure long-term access to computing power housed inside a Japanese-operated data center near Osaka. On paper, Tencent isn't buying GPUs at all. It's renting cloud services, just like any other enterprise customer would. The Japanese operator owns the hardware. Nvidia sells the chips legally. Everyone involved can point to compliance documents and say the rules were followed. But functionally, the outcome looks very different. Those GPUs aren't floating in a shared pool, spinning up random customer jobs. They're effectively reserved, dedicated, tuned for Tencent's AI training workloads, and running continuously at full capacity. The chips never leave Japan, but the intelligence they generate does. Training data flows in from China. Models are trained, refined, and scaled. Once the training is complete, the resulting systems are deployed wherever Tencent chooses. This is the moment where export bans collide with modern cloud reality. For decades, power was tied to physical possession. If you didn't own the machine, you didn't have the capability. Export controls were built around that assumption. Cloud computing breaks it entirely. You no longer need to own the hardware. You just need persistent access to it. And access scales faster than ownership ever could. A single contract can lock in tens of thousands of GPUs for years at a time, guaranteeing uninterrupted compute, regardless of what happens to supply elsewhere. From the outside, nothing appears unusual. From the inside, it's a strategic moat. Once Chinese firms recognized this, cloud infrastructure stopped being a convenience or cost-saving tool. It became a workaround for geopolitical pressure. And Tencent isn't treating this as a one-off experiment. The Japanese facility is only the beginning. Plans are already in motion to expand this model into other regions, including Australia, where additional data centers packed with Nvidia GPUs are being built with the same customers in mind. At that point, the question stops being whether China can access advanced AI chips. The question becomes how much of the world's high-end GPU supply gets quietly absorbed into long-term cloud contracts that never show up in export statistics. And that's when the ripple effects start spreading far beyond China. This isn't just Tencent. At first glance, Tencent's cloud arrangement in Japan might look like an exception, one unusually well-connected company finding a clever way around a tightening system. But the more you look, the harder that explanation becomes to defend, because Tencent wasn't alone for long. Once the cloud loophole became clear, other Chinese tech giants moved quickly and quietly to adopt the same approach. Not publicly, not with announcements, but through infrastructure decisions that only show up months later in reporting. Alibaba shifted significant portions of its advanced AI training to data centers in Southeast Asia, where access to high-performance Nvidia GPUs remained legal. ByteDance followed a similar path, relocating compute-intensive workloads outside China while keeping full control over the models, data, and deployment. In each case, the logic was identical. If advanced GPUs could no longer cross China's borders, then the training itself would. The most revealing case, however, came from DeepSeek. The company surprised the global AI community with models that performed far above expectations for their cost. That surprise wasn't just about algorithmic efficiency. It was was also about access. DeepSeek reportedly trained its systems using Nvidia hardware installed in non-Chinese data centers across Southeast Asia. But instead of relying solely on cloud access, it pushed the workaround further. Servers were disassembled abroad, components were imported separately, and the systems were reassembled for domestic use. That step marked an escalation. It showed that cloud access was only the first layer. When pressure increased, companies were willing to add complexity, cost, and risk to keep Nvidia-class compute in the loop. Taken together, these examples point to something much larger than a series of isolated decisions. They show an ecosystem adapting in real time. Different companies used different methods. Some stayed fully within cloud-based access. Others flirted with physical workarounds. But the objective was always the same: maintain uninterrupted access to the world's most powerful AI hardware. What's important here is not just that these workarounds exist, it's how fast they spread. Once one firm proves a method works, it becomes a template. Legal teams refine it. Infrastructure partners replicate it. Regulators fall behind. At that point, the workaround stops being temporary. It becomes standard practice. And that creates a deep contradiction. While Chinese companies are aggressively maintaining access to Nvidia GPUs abroad, the Chinese government is simultaneously pushing for domestic semiconductor self-reliance. How those two tracks coexist is the next piece of the puzzle. China's two-track strategy. On the surface, China's official position on advanced AI chips looks strict, even uncompromising. Beijing has placed limits on the use of Nvidia GPUs inside domestic data centers. Even chips the US technically allows for export, like Nvidia's H200, are expected to be imported only in limited quantities. The stated concern is dependency. Rely too heavily on Nvidia, and China's own semiconductor industry never catches up. That policy makes sense on paper. It's about sovereignty, resilience, and long-term control, but reality doesn't move at the speed of policy. While the government pushes domestic chip development, Chinese tech companies still face immediate pressure to compete globally in AI. Training frontier-scale models requires massive, reliable compute, and right now, no Chinese-made chip fully matches Nvidia's performance for that task. So, companies split the problem in two. Publicly, they align with the self-reliance narrative. They invest in domestic chips, pilot local hardware, and signal compliance with government priorities. Privately, they maintain access to Nvidia's most advanced GPUs through overseas infrastructure. Cloud access fills the gap without forcing a direct confrontation with either US export controls or Beijing's internal restrictions. This is the two-track strategy analysts keep pointing to. One track is political, the other is practical, and it's not hypocrisy, it's survival, because falling behind in AI isn't an abstract risk. It's lost market share, weaker platforms, and diminished global influence. Chinese firms can't afford to pause development while domestic hardware slowly improves. Quick pause here. If this breakdown is helping you see the bigger picture, hit like and subscribe. Stories like this don't show up in headlines, and you'll want to be here when the next piece drops. What makes this strategy effective is how carefully it avoids open conflict. Companies aren't defying the government. They're complying locally and compensating globally. They're not rejecting self-reliance. They're buying time. And as long as Nvidia's chips remain unmatched for large-scale AI training, that second track isn't going anywhere. Which brings us to the uncomfortable reality underneath all of this. No matter how many rules are written, Nvidia still sits at the center of the system. And that's where the real power imbalance shows up. Why Nvidia is still at the center of everything. At the core of every workaround, policy debate, and geopolitical headline sits a single, unavoidable reality. Nvidia is still the gatekeeper. No matter how export rules are rewritten or borders are drawn, Nvidia's hardware remains the foundation on which modern AI is trained. Every detour still leads back to the same place. That dominance didn't happen overnight. Nvidia spent years building not just fast GPUs, but an entire ecosystem around them. Its software stack, developer tools, libraries, and optimization pipelines are deeply woven into how AI models are designed, trained, and deployed. For Chinese tech companies, switching away from Nvidia isn't a simple procurement decision. It would require rewriting core systems, retraining engineering teams, re-optimizing models, and accepting meaningful performance losses during a period when speed and scale define competitiveness. Domestic Chinese chips are improving, and the push for self-reliance is real. But at the cutting edge, where trillion-parameter models and massive training runs dominate, Nvidia still has no full substitute. That reality creates a different kind of power. Not political power, structural power. When export bans tighten, Nvidia doesn't lose demand. demand simply changes shape. Instead of direct sales into China, chips flow into Japan, Southeast Asia, Australia, and other regions where cloud providers and data center operators can legally purchase them. From there, access is abstracted. The hardware stays put. The compute moves. From Nvidia's perspective, nothing improper is happening. The company sells to compliant customers, files the correct paperwork, and ships hardware where it's allowed to go. Revenue continues to climb. In fact, the restrictions can even strengthen Nvidia's position. Scarcity increases pricing power. Regulatory complexity favors incumbents with global reach. Smaller competitors struggle to scale under uncertainty, while Nvidia's ecosystem becomes even more entrenched. This creates a quiet but powerful feedback loop. As demand surges, more GPUs are locked into long-term infrastructure contracts. Multi-year deals reserve massive blocks of compute, pulling supply out of the open market. Those GPUs aren't just unavailable today, they're unavailable for years, and that has consequences far beyond geopolitics. It means fewer chips for startups trying to train their first models, fewer resources for researchers without massive budgets, less flexibility for anyone who isn't already inside a major cloud ecosystem. The global supply of high-end GPUs doesn't just shrink, it becomes less accessible, and once supply is locked in at that scale, prices don't gently correct, they harden. That's why this story isn't really about export bans or compliance. It's about who controls access to compute in a world where compute is power. And that's what makes the next phase unavoidable, because there's a point where demand, policy, and infrastructure collide, and that point is coming. The geopolitical time bomb. On the surface, the system still looks stable. Export controls exist, companies claim compliance, and governments point to regulations as evidence that they're steering the outcome. But beneath that appearance of control, pressure has been building quietly. The current arrangement relies on an uncomfortable compromise. Advanced AI chips remain physically outside China, satisfying the letter of export restrictions, while Chinese companies continue using them remotely through cloud infrastructure. Everyone involved understands what's happening, even if no one is eager to confront it directly. That's why analysts describe the situation as legally valid, but geopolitically delicate. From Washington's perspective, the implications are unsettling. If China can train cutting-edge AI models using Nvidia's most advanced chips without importing a single unit, then export bans have failed to achieve their central goal. Capability hasn't been blocked, it's been rerouted. This creates a dilemma with no easy exit. If the US moves to close the cloud loophole, it would mean regulating how compute is accessed globally, not just where hardware is shipped. That would involve allies, multinational cloud providers, and data centers operating under different legal systems. The disruption would be enormous, but if the loophole remains open, the message is just as damaging. It signals that restrictions on hardware exports alone are insufficient to slow China's AI progress. Either choice carries risk. What makes this especially dangerous is how entrenched the workaround has already become. Multi-year cloud contracts are in place, data centers are being built and expanded specifically to serve these workloads. Corporate AI roadmaps now assume uninterrupted access to overseas compute. At that point, sudden regulatory shifts don't just inconvenience companies, they destabilize entire ecosystems. And the shock wouldn't be contained to China. Global cloud providers, infrastructure partners, and even smaller customers sharing those resources would feel the impact. That's why this isn't a standoff that ends with a clean policy update. It's a pressure system that keeps accumulating stress over time. Nothing breaks immediately. The structure just becomes more brittle. And when something finally gives, whether it's policy, access, or supply, the consequences won't be evenly distributed. They'll cascade outward, which leads to the final, unavoidable question: who actually pays the price when this system strains? What this story reveals isn't a single loophole or a clever legal trick. It's a system quietly reshaping how power, access, and cost flow through the AI economy. Export bans didn't remove Nvidia's chips from China's reach. They changed the route. The hardware stayed overseas, the compute moved through the cloud, and the outcome stayed largely the same. China continues training advanced AI models. Nvidia continues selling its most valuable chips. Long-term contracts quietly lock up massive amounts of global GPU supply. The difference is who feels the pressure. When tens of thousands of high-end GPUs disappear into multi-year cloud deals, they don't vanish. They become unavailable. Unavailable to startups trying to compete. Unavailable to researchers without massive budgets. channels, unavailable to anyone outside the biggest platforms. This is why prices don't behave the way people expect. Supply doesn't loosen, it hardens. Access narrows. Costs rise. By the time 2026 arrives, the issue won't be whether GPUs are expensive. It will be who is even allowed to touch them. And that's the real consequence of this loophole. Not a headline, not a policy failure, a structural shift. You're not watching a shortage, you're watching control consolidate. The question now isn't whether this system exists, it's how long it can hold before something finally snaps. If this breakdown helped you see what's actually happening behind the scenes, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more deep dives like this. And tell me in the comments, who do you think pays the real price when access to AI compute becomes a privilege instead of a resource?